Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's History is Lunch program. We're in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. And we're streaming live on both Facebook and YouTube, where those videos are available to watch anytime afterwards. And if you've not already done so, please silence your phone. Our new temporary exhibit of rarely shown flags from the MDAH collection is open upstairs in the FedEx Exhibition Hall. Admission is free, as is admission to these museums for History's Lunch attendees. This Sunday, May 19th at 2 p.m. in the auditorium, we'll screen the documentary Rosenwald. The film tells the story of Julius Rosenwald, who was the president and CEO of Sears Roebuck, and the Rosenwald Fund, the product of an alliance between Booker T. Washington and Rosenwald. Grants to black communities to help build schools. When the philanthropic program ended in 1932, more than 5,000 schools had been constructed in 14 southern states, including 633 schools and related buildings in Mississippi. Jennifer Bond, who is our chief historical architect, is going to be on a panel after. She's also one of the leading experts on Rosenwald schools and the expert on Rosenwald schools in Mississippi. So I hope that we'll see y'all at 2 o'clock Sunday for that. And then come back next week for History's Lunch, when we'll be joined by Ben Fothery, who will present the origins of the Mississippi Community College system. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Kidada E. Williams, the author of I Saw Death Coming, A History of Terror and Survival in the War Against Reconstruction. Kidada Williams is professor of history at Wayne State University. She earned her PhD from the University of Michigan and her MA and BS from Central Michigan University. Williams is the author of I Saw Death Coming, A History of Terror and Survival in the War Against Reconstruction, which was longlisted for the 2023 National Book Award for Nonfiction, and They Left Great Marks on Me, African-American Testimonies of Racial Violence from Emancipation to World War I. She is co-editor of the Charleston Syllabus and the host and creator of the podcast, Seizing Freedom. Help me welcome Kidada Williams.
Okay, can you hear me? Great. Thank you, Chris, for that introduction, for inviting me and handling all of the logistics. You all have a really well-oiled machine, and I really appreciate it. Good afternoon, and thank you all so much for coming out, especially on such a lovely day. Spring is finally sprung in Detroit, and you can't keep us inside. You all are inside. In Detroit, we are not inside. And so I really want to thank you all for coming out. And I also want to thank the people who are joining us via the live stream. It's such an honor to be here in Jackson for this History is Lunch event. My book, I Saw Death Coming, centers on African Americans seizing their freedom, including Mississippians. I'm going to tell the story of the book through two families, the Crosbys from Mississippi and the Lionses from Alabama. So my talk is one part book reading from different parts of the book and one part contextualization, which I hope will make for a productive Q&A. On a November night in 1871, just outside of Aberdeen, Mississippi, Edward Crosby stepped outside to get water for his thirsty child. Suddenly, he heard and felt the thunder of a team of horses. He gazed out and saw about 30 disguised men descending on his home. Their mounts were draped with full body cloth coverings. Mrs. Crosby, who heard the men approaching too, asked Edward who and what they were. Edward had heard stories about armed men on horseback galloping through the countryside, torturing and murdering black families in the middle of the night during recent elections. Edward told his wife he reckoned the gang headed for them were what people in their community called Ku Klux, shorthand for the Ku Klux Klan. Edward's landlord and employer had told him he would kill him if he tried to vote. Edward promised the man that he wouldn't vote, but he knew that the only way to break the grip enslavers still had on his family's future was to help elect candidates who would advance his right to freedom. So Edward showed up to vote, but he was denied the ballot he requested. When he and other black men who were there to vote protested, the white men running the polling place threatened them. Defeated, Edward went home and prayed that there wouldn't be a fallout. That's how Edward knew who the white men were. until worried that the death that he had heard about being visited upon people in his community was coming for him. But hoping that he might spare his wife and children, Edward slipped into his family's smokehouse. He thought the men might not think to look there, and he didn't think that they would hurt his wife. When the posse arrived in the Crosby's yard, several of the men got down from their horses and called for Edward. Edward retained his composure and stayed in his hiding place. Mrs. Crosby calmly told the men she didn't know where her husband was. Maybe he was visiting his sister. Maybe he was visiting another relative. She just didn't know. So the men hung around a bit before accepting that they would miss their target and leaving. The Crosby's protection scheme worked. No one was physically hurt, but that didn't mean they emerged unscathed. The extremists' arrival revealed to the family that they had been marked as enemies. And this terrified the family and left them afraid that their lives would never be the same. When I last found their family in the records, Edward was returning home to his family, still shaken by the visit and worried that there might be some consequences because he went and testified before Congress. Abe and Eliza Lyons' family wasn't as lucky. By 1870, the family had accomplished a great deal. Abe, as we know from some of the records, was 30 years old and Eliza was 35. They got legally married and set up their home in a little village in Choctaw County, Alabama. Abe was working as a blacksmith from his own shop. Eliza left her job in domestic service, and she was keeping her own house, only working on the plantation every once in a while just to earn a little bit of extra money. The family had a horde of hogs, and they were specifically breeding for the market. The family had saved $600, the relative worth of which today is more than $200,000. And they planned to move to Demopolis, buy property, and build a home of their own. I think most of us would agree that that's a significant achievement just out of slavery. Secession and the founding of the Confederacy were less than a decade in the past. Barely 5 years separated these two families from the end of the bloody Civil War. The Lionses were living their best post-emancipation life, and the Crosbys were trying to get there. I think that's important to acknowledge because their testimonies and other records make clear that they were making the most of freedom. But those achievements provide context for why Confederates targeted them in the White Southern War on Freedom. Like many Americans, when I was in school, I was either not taught anything about Reconstruction or I was taught that it failed. So I researched other topics because who studies a failure? But the more I researched the records of the era myself, the more I recognized what a truly transformative moment this was. There are so many revolutionary developments that the historian Eric Foner called Reconstruction the second founding after the American Revolution. And families like the Crosbys and the Lionses were part of this transformative moment. They had joined more than 4 million other Black people who helped snatch freedom from Confederates and who tried to live upright after slavery. And so what we see is that the historical records, even the visual culture from the time, what they all show, so if we think about the different types of historical records, visual culture, testimonies, reports, WPA interviews, folklore, art, correspondence, speeches, newspapers, savings accounts deposits with the Freedmen's Bureau, census records, marriage certificates, voting logs, what all of these records reveal is that by 1870, these Black Southerners had picked themselves up from slavery. They had reassembled their families to the best of their ability. They worked, they established their communities with churches, schools, orphanages, newspapers, mutual aid associations, and more. And again, this is reflected in the visual culture. Some had acquired land or opened their own businesses like Abe had. Others were like Edward. They were working, being industrious, and saving money with their eyes fixed on the prize of having their own homesteads. Black men wanted to vote and serve in office to protect all of these rights and to secure their families' futures. But some Confederates, who hadn't really given up the cause of subjugating and exploiting Black people, saw these strides African Americans had made or were attempting to make as a threat to their ongoing mastery. And so they fought to sustain their privileges in the American system. Confederates launched a torrent of violent attacks on Black people who were reaping the rewards of Reconstruction's expansion of freedom and democracy. When recalling Klan violence in Mississippi to WPA interviewers in the 1930s, a formerly enslaved man named Isaac Steer, who spent a good portion of his life around Natchez, described what happened as the devil being turned loose. In the spring of 1866, white men in Pulaski, Tennessee formed social clubs in which they sometimes donned masks or elaborate costumes, played pranks, and performed musical entertainment. The white men called themselves the Ku Klux Klan. In time, we see that Klansmen's activity spread quickly across the South and evolved to roaming armed through communities in the middle of the night, conducting paramilitary attacks on Black and even some progressive white families. Extremists and their apologists often refer to these raids euphemistically as visits, masking their brutality behind the veneer of a friendly social call. Klansmen's work gave rise to an extremist movement that became so widespread that any group of white men who wanted to intimidate or kill their targets might be associated with it, whether they were actually involved with the Klan or not. As more white Southern men mustered into the growing Shadow Army's ranks and started experimenting with their acts of terror, they grew more deadly. Klan violence is part of what I call the white Southern War on Freedom. Now, it might seem odd to liken what we've been taught was the peace to war. But wars never end as neatly as they appear to in history books, and if there are any veterans in the room, I'm sure that they can affirm that. They're often followed by new conflicts. And after the Civil War, the new conflict was some white Southerners' fight to undercut Black people's freedom and the establishment of a more egalitarian democracy. And so there was no peace, as the historian George Rabel put it, especially not for Black people trying to live freely in the South. And African Americans like the Crosbys and the Lionses knew it. White extremists shot down Black male voters at the polls. They stalked Black office holders, trying to offer them bribes to leave office, and then they assassinated them when that didn't work. They ambushed African American families with nighttime raids, and you can see from this image here, this is an illustration of a raid on a family. During these visits, white men holding Black families hostage subjected them to humiliation, rape, torture, and murder. William Coleman, who was from Winston County, Mississippi, described the death squads that he saw raiding Black settlements in his community as coming riding up in great droves like they were going to the army to fight. No one was safe. Army and Freedmen's Bureau records are full of reports, and many of these observers and investigators used the word terror and terrorism to describe what was happening. In addition to night riding visits, there were countless massacres and other mass killing events as white extremists overthrew Reconstruction. I think it's important to acknowledge that Black people resisted this violence, to be sure, in ways that made sense to them in the moment. Some hid or fled, but many bore arms and defended their homes, injuring or killing their attackers if they could. And you can see here, it says colored voters swimming the creek on election day. And what you have here are the men who are crossing the creek, and they have weapons because they know that the only way they can vote is if they are armed and prepared to shoot back at the people who might shoot them down at the polls. So Black people are resisting this violence, to be sure. But what we see is that the white extremist violence is so widespread that Black Southerners often found themselves outmanned and outgunned. White communities conspired to disarm Black militias and Black men known to have weapons. Thousands of Black men, women, and children are injured and killed. And there are some federal troops stationed throughout the region, and there are some black and white people working together, but not nearly enough to quell the slaughter. Reconstruction didn't just fall apart. White Southern extremists overthrew it, and the rest of the nation essentially left them. I Saw Death Coming tells that story. It follows black Southern families on their journeys out of slavery to the achievements that they managed to make that were very much like what we see Abe and Eliza accomplish. Through their experiences of the war white extremists waged on their freedom, to their testimonies before Congress and beyond. It shows how black people understood and articulated the human costs of Reconstruction's violent overthrow and callous abandonment. And it does that through the stories of families like Abe and Eliza Lyons's. On June 6, 1871, Abe spent the day in his blacksmithing shop, and Eliza completed her homemaking tasks. The family was in bed at 11 p.m. when someone knocked on their door and asked if Abe was home. The family hadn't heard of any threats. So Abe answered that he was, and he started to get up to answer the door. But something, perhaps the sight or sound of the visitors, or his awareness of the threat they pose, the record doesn't show what it was, but whatever it was, it so terrified Abe that he didn't move. Human bodies and minds are wired to sustain themselves and focus solely on survival and avoiding injury when under attack. When the mind detects a threat to life like Abe experienced, it triggers these pre-programmed escape plans. And it does this by releasing these stress chemicals to propel the body into action, specifically to survive by running, hiding, or fighting. But for some people, especially those who've had a prior significant trauma, and one can imagine that an enslaved man like Abe, who lived through the end of slavery and the war, that he could have had a prior significant trauma. For people who have a prior significant trauma, sometimes the unthinkable happens. Their brain's defense circuitry shuts down and they freeze. And I think that's what happened to Abe. Eliza said that he, quote, looked like he was in a perfect scare, like his feet were bolted to the floor, suggesting that he's completely paralyzed by fear. And Abe remained in that trance-like state, prompting Eliza to act in hopes of guiding her husband to safety and protecting herself and their children. So Eliza grabbed Abe, trying to steer him out the back door. He was so scared, she recalled. He wheeled around the room in that scare, not knowing what to do. But that gave the invaders time to burst through the door. They threw a rope over Abe's head and dragged him outside and away from their home and up a hill nearby. Eliza didn't follow, not with children under 10 in the house, awake, crying. They might follow her as she followed him, and they might all be killed. But soon she saw the flash and heard the blast of a double-barrel shotgun. Then one of the men shouted an order for the rest of the gang to fire, and they did. After the terrorists killed Abe, Eliza said she spotted about 75 men returning to her home. I knew they were going to kill me, she said. So Eliza ran back inside to gather her children, but her son William had disappeared. What she didn't know is that he had gone to the neighbors to get help. Moving with her daughters by her side, and Eliza snuck out back to a field neighboring their home. They stopped at a thicket of woods to monitor the men's activities and take stock. Eliza couldn't go anywhere without knowing where William was. And so she and the girls watched from the woods as the white men made up a light and began searching and ransacking their home. They remained hidden until sunrise, when Eliza could see that the white men had left. And what she says is that they tore up everything. After sunrise, she went to confirm Abe's killing and then to find William, who was safe with the neighbors who wouldn't let him go back. Eliza and the children lost Abe, their cash, and all their possessions, that year's crop, their hogs, and most of Abe's tools. Their home had been destroyed, and the men's knowledge that they had left an adult witness meant that it probably wasn't safe for the family to continue living on the homestead. Eliza reported what happened to local authorities. A grand jury was convened to investigate the spate of paramilitary attacks. They weren't the only ones attacked that night. There were a number of people attacked. But many of the witnesses were too afraid to talk. Initially, Eliza wasn't afraid. She was ready to testify. She was ready to get justice for Abe. It's not clear who or what spooked them, but suddenly Eliza and the children shot out of the county. En route, she heard that Abe's killers were pursuing them, but she and the children picked up their pace. And she said that a morning thunderstorm slowed down the men. The men stopped when the storm came. They kept going, which enabled the family to make it to Demopolis, where Eliza hoped they might be safe. Targeted People's reports of atrocities to Freedmen's Bureau agents, Army personnel, local, state, and federal officials were like urgent dispatches from the front lines of the War on Reconstruction. Receiving a flood of accounts of attacks like the one on Eliza's family, the U.S. Congress convened an investigation. The committee's work became known as the Klan hearings because of how prominently white paramilitary violence featured in the investigation. Lawmakers traveled to, so you can see here, lawmakers traveled to southern hotspots where they solicited testimony from office holders, voters, accused perpetrators, and their victims. And you can see on the right, this was the previous slide, that this is a portion of Eliza's testimony. Families like the Crosbys and Lionses had greeted emancipation with great expectation. Many of them had achieved their dreams of freedom or were on their way to doing so when the white men came for them. So when Congress issued the call for witnesses, they stepped forward, hoping to convince federal officials to end the violence so their families could live in peace. Eliza Lyons, now a widow, lost everything. Displaced from her home community and support network, she was struggling to care for herself and the children. Whatever progress her family had made, they lost. And that's exactly what white men waging war on Black people's freedom intended, to destroy everything Black people built after slavery and leave them with nothing. And I think it's fair to say that many of them hope that they have no choice but to return to the plantations. Facing the prospect that that would happen and that the world wouldn't know what extremists had done to them, survivors like Eliza and Edward stepped forward at great risk to themselves and their families and reported what happened. Brave survivors and witnesses made their way to the hearing sites, carrying stories of violent attacks as extremists made clear their determination to sustain slavery as much as possible. Now, enslavers had released Black people from bondage, but I argue that we see from who, when, and why extremists attacked, that they didn't believe that Black people had the right to their children, to choose their sexual partners, to education, to free religious life, to labor autonomy, to homes, land, businesses, capital, and political power to protect all of those rights. Eliza, Edward Crosby, and other survivors and witnesses, their decision to testify, I argue, was informed by their individual and collective sense of self-respect. Their accounts challenged the stories we've been told about Reconstruction's supposed failure. Speaking with one voice, survivors said white extremists were waging war on Reconstruction by attacking Black people who were making the most of freedom. And a recurring theme in all the survivors' testimonies is their belief that they never get over what happened to them during these attacks. These testimonies helped drive the federal investigation that drove the first Ku Klux Klan underground, but not before white extremists seriously undercut Black people's freedom and participation in American democracy. After Confederates overthrew Reconstruction and boarded up the Temple of Liberty, they crafted the big lie that the experiment in American democracy had failed. They falsely claimed that white Northerners had unfairly punished white Southerners for secession by enacting, quote, Black rule. Black men voted and they were elected into office, but they never enacted any policies that took away white people's human, civil, or political rights. But none of that mattered to the Confederates and their supporters who falsely claimed that emancipation, equal rights, and the franchise were wasted on Black people. These claims were part of a larger white supremacist political project to deny Black people dignity and life in freedom. White extremists claimed they had no choice. They had to restore their honor. So they formed even more white terror gangs and attacked even more Black people, and eventually installed the racist apartheid system of Jim Crow. Federal officials had the power to enforce the Reconstruction Amendments and honor the Constitution, but largely lacked the will. Now, inevitably, someone will ask me during the question and answer session about the, quote, good white people. And I think the most generous interpretation is that the questioner wants to find comfort in this story of harm and pain from someone with whom they can identify. Were there some white Southerners who weren't extremists and didn't engage in paramilitary violence? Yes. Weren't there times Black and white people worked together? Sure. But I think we have to grapple with the historical record and be honest about this. There weren't enough to stop the slaughter and dispossession of tens of thousands. There weren't enough to make sure that even known perpetrators were brought to justice. There weren't enough to avert lynching, rampages, massacres, and there certainly weren't enough to prevent Jim Crow from being installed. And I saw death coming. I used testimonies like Edward's and Eliza's to challenge this failure narrative of Reconstruction. And I do this because I think that understanding Black family stories of racing into freedom and the price white extremists made them pay in the war against it, Americans learned that the arc of our history doesn't always bend toward justice. This story, I think, is essential to understanding why our struggle continues more than a century and a half later. Thank you. And I'll open the floor to questions.
If anyone has a question, you can raise your hand and we'll bring the microphone to you.
Could you tell us the circumstances of these congressional hearings? What did people travel to them, and in what format were they held?
Yeah, great question. So they do travel to them. They're not happening everywhere. You've got, let's see if I can go back to the map. They're not happening in every location, and they're often happening in the locations where members of Congress feel that the governors haven't done enough to try to address the violence. And so people, they will have to travel to the hearing sites. And that means they have to be physically able to travel. That means they have to have the financial means to travel and the interest in traveling. And so they go to these sites. These are public events. So everyone knows that you've testified. There's a record. They're sometimes published in the newspapers. And you've got questioners from, it's a joint committee, so you've got Democrats and Republicans who are on the committee asking questions, interviewing the witnesses. So they have local law enforcement, local elected officials, accused perpetrators, and victims testify at the hearings. So you get these 13 volumes, they're huge volumes, and you've got the transcription of the testimonies. So they're all there. You also have in South Carolina in particular, and I think in Louisiana in some places, you got the trials. So you've got the trial records too, and some of those records are added into the testimonies. Did I answer your question? Yes. Okay. And these have been digitized, they're available online, you can take a look at them.
Well, one follow-up. Looked like you had other records. Was that you further researched people who had revealed themselves through the testimony?
Yes, so I went searching for them in as many records as I could find. And when I was reading the testimonies, there were people who kept referencing census assessors coming through. They would say, this is how much land I have, and a member of Congress would scoff and say, there's no way coming out of slavery you can have that much land, et cetera. And what the interviewee or the witness will say is, the census assessor just came through, right, to assess me for the taxes, so, right? And so that clued me in that maybe I should take a look at the census. And so that's what I did. I tried to follow as many families as I could. And I was able to find some families coming up to the 1920s, but I lost a lot of them, particularly the women, right? Because especially if they married, then it was harder to track them. Some of the men, when they testify, they're quite old. And so it's, you can imagine that they died potentially of natural causes or maybe or attacked as a result of them testifying. So they're harder to trace. But I was able to find some of the people. But I also looked for them in earlier records to see if I could find marriage certificates, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes, I enjoyed your presentation very much. My question deals with a narrative that I've heard since I was 10 years old, that Reconstruction essentially ended because of the dispute over the outcome of the 1876 presidential election, and that the Republicans basically said, let us keep the White House, we'll get out. Is that just a narrative I've heard, or is there a lot of truth to that?
So what I'll say is that the process of overthrowing Reconstruction had been ongoing, right? And it's not just one thing that does it. What you see is that and historians are reassessing this argument that 1877 or that election is the end of Reconstruction. There had been a lot of assaults on Reconstruction, and so a lot of historians would say that Reconstruction doesn't really end until Jim Crow is installed, right? So you have to go through additional things beyond that election, because in 1876, black men are still voting. And they're going to continue voting until those laws are passed that drive them out of office. So I think I like to tell my students that history is very much like phones, right? Now, you remember the first car phones that were like this big, right? So sometimes, like the history that I got, in K through 12, it's quite old. So it's one of those earlier versions. And so I think what's happened is that the historiography has caught up. It's dug a little bit deeper to get a better sense of all of the dynamics. So we don't list Reconstruction as ending in 1876. We look at the process of tearing it down and abandoning it as a longer process. So it's a lot more intricate, it's a lot more detailed, and it includes a lot of this violence. The number of people killed, the people who are driven out of office, the number of black elected officials who are assassinated during this period, all of that plays a role in undermining Reconstruction in the South.
Looking at that map, I'm a little surprised that Mississippi has fewer dots in it than the rest of the places. Why is that?
Great question. So there's a lot of resistance in Mississippi to even holding the trials or even having the investigation be here. The other reason is that with Mississippi, with the other states, they allow more witnesses more ordinary people to testify. Mississippi, they only allow like the sort of bona fide black people to testify, right? And so there's a lot more resistance to the trials being here. But the thing about Mississippi, and you can talk to Chris and other people who work at the archives, is that there are subsequent and other investigations. And so there are records beyond the ones I looked at that really drill down into what's going on. But what you see is that there's resistance, right? And sometimes what you'll see in the states is that the governors say, why do you want to come to my state? Everything is good, right? Even though it's not. And there is, in Congress, there is a lot of resistance to the hearings, particularly by conservatives, because they're like, these are, we're in peacetime, we should let the South do what they want to do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so there is resistance. And this is part of what you see here in Mississippi.
I really enjoyed your presentation. I have a question. How far back, the Freedmen's Bureau starts in 1865, and of course the Reconstruction amendments are happening about that same time. But here in Mississippi, the Vicksburg campaign has a dramatic effect on the freedom of the enslaved people, at least in that area. And all of that carries we're talking about 2 or 3 years before the Reconstruction thing. And so there is an effort to try to deal with the newly freed people and provide opportunities for them. But there's also, goes into the complexity of war.
Yeah.
Just because the battle's over doesn't mean the battle's over.
Yeah.
So how far back did you take your research?
Right. So one thing I'll say is, just as I answer the question about Reconstruction ending, historians, the consensus is that it ends later. The consensus about Reconstruction is that it begins before 1865. So when we have to look at the Emancipation Proclamation as part of Lincoln's Reconstruction. So that takes us to 1863. So what we see, and you're right, what we see is that, and there is a great book that'll be coming out in a few years. There's a recent PhD student at Harvard named Micah Connor. She's looking at the violence enslavers are committing against Mississippians and Missourians. So she's looking at the Mississippi Valley region during this period. And what she finds is that with the Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect, African Americans know about it, and they are leaving farms and plantations, and a lot of them are being slaughtered in the process. So if they can't be dragged back, they're being killed. And so when I talk in the book, I talk about that process starting earlier. But what we see is that, the language I use is that freedom is on the move. And the people that I talk about, they have managed to survive escaping slavery and getting on their feet and, managing to accomplish what they did. And what we see in a lot of the records is that families say it takes about 3 to 5 years for them to get land, right? And so the violence really starts to tick up around the time families are getting land and when Black men are being elected into office. So it's just as they're like really on the upswing. But that violence, as you know, is starting earlier. It's starting as Black people are escaping slavery. Now, as I tell my students, it doesn't make sense for enslavers to just kill the people they hold in bondage all willy-nilly, right? That's not hard math. But the people who are escaping slavery or who manage to get away from the people who held them in bondage, that's a completely different story. And so there is this kind of, I would argue, mass killing event before the war is over. The challenge is that Civil War historians have been resistant to grappling with it. Right? They're all in their little feelings about, because if they have to look at what's happening with the violence, they have to look at what the federal government and what the U.S. Army will and won't do. And sometimes what they won't do, and some would argue they can't do, is fight a war on two fronts. They can't fight a war on two fronts any better than the Confederates can. And so what some Civil War historians, what they feel is, yes, they're killing Black people, but they've got these battles to win, right? And what we see from the records, like scholars like Savolia Glimp, their records, even U.S. Army soldiers are like, this was dirty. We're going to go to hell for this. In terms of turning their backs on people who are trying to keep up with them to escape the people who held them in bondage and being slaughtered in the process. So those are all over the records, and Civil War historians, military historians in particular, they've seen these records, they've just deemed them not important. But there are more and more historians who are getting in there. They're like, no, how can page 1 of this record be important and this paragraph that's talking about this massacre not be, right? And so there are more historians who are going in and sitting with those stories and sort of unearthing them and telling the histories about them.
Yes, I just had a question. What can you point to as some of the outcomes of these congressional hearings?
So members of Congress, they're there. It's just literally an investigation. They want to know what's happening. So families, they don't get their land back. They certainly can't raise the dead. What members of Congress will try to do is to use the information from the investigations to pass new legislation to prosecute people who are doing this. And so, but you get the legislation, but if you've got, former Confederates or their allies as the governor, right? And during this time, former Confederates and their allies are returning to office. You can have the law on the books, but if it's not enforced, what is it going to do? So they get the information. We have the historical record. We know what's happening during this period. Congress will use the information that they're getting from these accounts to send Secret Service agents. This is before the Department of Justice has its body of agents, so they have to get them from Treasury. So they send Secret Service agents to the South to investigate, and they're locking up people left and right. Locking up people. But hardly any of the people they arrest and even try and convict do time. They're pardoned by newly installed governors. They just don't show up when they're supposed to. They leave the community for a period of time and come back a few years later, right? So you've got the investigation, you know. And I do my part, like I could spend a lifetime on Ancestry.com tagging records, like this person is accused of atrocities during Reconstruction, right? That's a lifetime project. But a lot of those people who are even convicted, there are no consequences for what they've done. And so people, they feel even more emboldened, right, to take additional steps with lynching and Jim Crow. Yeah. So if you've got questions, make sure you shoot your hand up so Chris can see it, so we can get you on the microphone. Chris, we got 2 hands up here after this one. Okay, cool.
Thank you for that excellent presentation.
Thank you.
I'm just wondering, ex-slaves, black people are the majority single ethnic group in Mississippi after slavery. Blacks are in the majority in Mississippi and some of the southern states. And they, at first at least, they're able to vote and have representatives in Congress. To what extent the representation that they had in Congress, together with the Freedmen's Bureau, which was also an organization representing blacks, to what extent these institutions and public servants in Congress were they able to effectively make any kind of representation to try to resist the efforts by the Klan to reduce the violence against black people? Or were there other organizations that could help them to represent, to make representation to defeat the Klan?
Yeah. So you do have a variety of entities that will try to take action, but they're in the minority. I think part of what's happened is that there has been this, there's the sort of understood lost cause for the South, but there's the abolitionist cause for the North. I'm from Michigan, and they all insist we're abolitionists, right? And I'm the one who's like, lies. But they have told themselves, and the nation has told itself, that anti-blackness is a regional issue. It's not a national issue. And so for one, it's a national issue, and there are a lot of people in the United States at the time who only accept emancipation in order to win the war quickly, or end the war quickly, I should say. So they're not exactly happy about emancipation. And so they're not exactly willing to do much to stop the violence from happening. They're like, well, I understand. I would be frustrated too. Even with respect to Mississippi's demographic profile, you do have black men, black communities that are defending themselves, but they're also being actively disarmed, sometimes by the U.S. Army. What are you going to do when the Army shuts down your militia? The U.S. Army shuts down your militia. What are you going to do when the U.S. Army takes your weapons? You try to get additional weapons, but gun sellers are not, especially if they are tied to the extremists, they're not going to sell you weapons, are they? So their inability to stop the violence isn't because they just didn't try. The system is set up for them to not be able to succeed in this. You also have, with respect to troops in the region, they're technically in peacetime. And so the footprint of the Army is shrinking. And there are times when they say, they're like, there are times when there are like, people say there are troops in Mississippi. Yes, but there are like 200 here in Jackson, right? And the violence is happening up in places like Columbus. And what you see is that the former Confederates are like, we're in peacetime. Why are we being occupied? And there's additional pressure to reduce the number of troops that are in the state. So there are people who are resisting, but not enough. Not enough of the people who are in positions of power and authority will do what it takes to end the violence. And that has everything to do with the anti-Black racism in the society.
I wonder if you're familiar, some people who haven't.
Yeah, let's go ahead, but I want to make sure we get these questions over here from people who haven't gone.
Are you familiar with the work of Justin Barron, Reconstructing Democracy? Kind of is set more in the Southwest, the Natchez district, and across the river in Louisiana. And he's dealing with this period of when Black people were being elected and appointed to office
right.
in great numbers. And so I just didn't know if you had looked at that. He does also document or report, include in his scholarship, some of the massacres or the large-scale violent overthrows kind of a Black sheriff in Claiborne County
yeah.
or a Black sheriff in other places.
Yeah, and so, so even the Black people who are being elected, they're doing what they can until they're assassinated, right? They're doing what they can until the Confederates come back to power. So what you see is that they are doing what they can to resist the system, but and what you have to know is that the resistance or the commitment to anti-Blackness is not only in Mississippi. People are crossing the border, right, to participate in a massacre and then going back home. Chris, next question. So yes, I'm not familiar with that book, but the sort of larger politics of Black elected officials and what they're trying to do, yes.
History, I think, should also illuminate policy, current policy. And I'm wondering, from what you've learned, how you, and there's a lot of deja vu in what I've been hearing today, in rhetoric, dialogue, current dialogue about diversity and things of that nature. So from what you've read and learned, how would you inform policymakers today about where we need to go?
I would say don't do what they did, right? Take purposeful action to end the violence and commit to justice. But my saying it isn't enough. What they need is a preponderance of Americans who put them into office to actually make that real policy and make it law. This sort of, what's happened then, what's happening now is not because Black people don't want justice enough. All we want is to be free, equal, and secure like everybody else. So we're not the problem with this. The rest of the nation that doesn't want us to be free, equal, and secure, they're the problem with this. And so ruling elites listen to the white majority. And so the question to sort of, is not what I could say to members of Congress, it's what members of the white majority can say to members of Congress or to governors or to the President of the United States or the Supreme Court. What does it take to hear from them that there's a real commitment to justice? So we got 3 questions up here. There was a lady, and I think on the end, yeah. Okay.
I'm glad that last question you started to answer that part of it. Yeah. Personally, what opposition have you faced, with this work and what you do now to uncover this history? Because I think 90% of this is, can we unveil this history so that everyone can actually see it? What roadblocks are you finding?
Right. Great question. And a question I'm much more comfortable with than with policy, because I'm a historian. All of the people I study are dead. But the opposition came mostly from historians who are comfortable, historians of the Civil War and Reconstruction, who are comfortable with a very particular history that leaves this out or that doesn't approach it the way I do. And it's not to say that historians haven't grappled with these historical sources, because they have, they're well known. But what historians going through the records have often done is focus on the fact of election violence, right? That's what they home in on, that's what they deem important. The impact that these men says that this has on their families, the catalog of physical injuries, the trauma, testimonies like Eliza's. You know, the first time I read that testimony, I completely missed he was in a perfect scare, right? Because I had been trained to not pay attention to that. And I had to sort of get multidisciplinary training to be able to see and sit with those traumatic injuries, the loss, et cetera. And so what I found is that there are historians who think that that's not historically significant, or that they think we need a much more uplifting story. And so I think that that does a terrible injustice to people like Eliza. And if any of her descendants are alive today, to say that there are stories that are more important, that you need a more uplifting story. So most of the resistance that I've gotten is from professional historians, some in publishing who want like a nice, comfortable feel-good history, and that's not my zone, right? That's not what I do. I study survivors of violence, and I take seriously their accounts of what they say happened to them. But overall, I feel like the reception has been pretty good. It's a story that people, they think they know, they get a new version of it, they hear something that's a little more complicated than what they thought, and they seem to be open to my storytelling, so. Thank you.
I have some curiosities. We don't know that there are Black people who own property, but after Lincoln was assassinated, the president, I think, Andrew Johnson, repealed the law that gave land to the formerly enslaved people. When it was repealed, he gave the land back to the original owners, and I also heard that the owners have been paid. Now, a two-part question is, how is it that some people were able to keep the land and own it today, and when and how did they phase in the sharecropper system?
Okay. I think that it's important to know that even after what Johnson did, Black people still got land. They got land because they were working, and they bought it. And if they weren't driven off of it, they held on to it. They also are able to tap into the Southern Homestead Act. And and some are able to do well, but some of them, that land is wide and vast. And so sometimes people, they find that their claim is in like a rocky area that won't grow crops, right? So they got land, they can't do what they want to do with the land. So people, they have land, but people are buying land on their own because they're working. Sharecropping in the early years is a means by which people do acquire land. After the first 3, 4, I'll say 5 years. 5 years, they're able to sharecrop and then transition into their own business owners or their own landowners. But after that, there's much more exploitation. And you see the landowners and the merchants start to conspire to take even more and more and more and more. So part of what happens with sharecropping is people are looking at sharecropping from the 1920s and assuming that that's existed the entire time. That's not the case. There was this window where people are sharecropping and they are getting land. And, they're getting a plot here and a plot there, but they're getting it. So it's a much more complicated history. People are getting land even after Johnson. And I think the other thing about, actually, I will not go into 40 acres and the mule because it's much more complex. So, other questions?
You actually essentially answered it. I was curious about the land ownership situation.
Yeah.
All these thousands of acres of land that were black-owned, how were they dispersed after Reconstruction started to fail? Did they go into become public property, or did it find its way into the hands of white families?
It found its way into the hands of the white families. Mostly because the white families are driving them off the land. What families say is that they don't even get a time to unpack before they get visited or harassed, and whose land is this? Can you prove that this land is yours? And they're like, here's my paper proving it, right? So they're being menaced and harassed, but there are families that are able to hold on to the land. And they may lose it in the early part of the 20th century. So families are able, if they're not attacked during this period, families are often able to hold on to that land for a generation or two. They may lose it during the Great Depression, or they may lose it during one of the economic crises, one of the many economic crises we see in the late 19th, early 20th century. But a lot of people are able to hold on to the land.
Yes, my question is this, sort of on terminology in two different periods. Dropping back to 1954 and the Brown decision, forward probably through Lyndon Johnson to 1968 with Nixon's Southern strategy, the tendency on racial harmony was the melting pot, that we were going to become a united nation through the melting pot. That continued a little bit after Nixon, and now it's that we're broken up into diversity. Which one do you think is the answer to the problem of having a democracy in the United States?
White people not being racist? I mean, it's flipped, but it's, it's the main thing. When people talk about racial harmony, it's a convenient way to not acknowledge that if black people are resisting, if black people are frustrated, it's because of racism, right? When we talk about racial harmony, when we talk about race relations, it's conveniently in the passive voice, and it doesn't acknowledge what the relations are. The tension is black people resisting their subjugation, right? And as long as black people are comfortable and quiet and not protesting the injustice of being denied equality in the United States, then things are considered to be harmonious, right? But I think I like King's language of calling that a toxic peace, right? And so, I'm not particularly invested in what people call it. I'm more invested in justice, right? And justice looks like black people having the right to be free, equal, and secure, and having access to the same opportunities as everyone else in the country. Yes? No, you, ma'am. You.
Can we get the one on mic and we'll get her last?
But just make sure, because you've not seen her hand several times. So yes, go ahead.
She'll raise her hand right now. I promise I'll bring it to her.
Okay, raise, yes, right here.
Thank you, Dr. Williams, for your wonderful work. I guess I have two questions. The first one is, when the congressional hearings were taking place, how was it covered in the newspapers? And I guess regionally within the South, but also nationally. That seems to me a really important question about the kind of narratives that we've inherited today. Right. And then the second question is, if we're thinking about Reconstruction and a war on Reconstruction being this kind of protracted process that it slowly erodes it over several decades, how does that transform our understanding of Jim Crow? And then how do you make sense of Jim Crow as the kind of triumph of almost maybe you could call it like a white guerrilla war. How do you make sense of Jim Crow as the kind of the bearing of fruit for that?
So the first question is that it's covered differently in different newspapers. So it's there. The people who don't like the hearings are covering it in a certain way. The people who think the hearings might lead to justice are covering it in another. So it varies significantly. Americans know the hearings are taking place, just like they could know the hearings that are taking place today. You just have to be, I think, interested in those hearings to tune into newspaper coverage of it. The other question in terms of Jim Crow being installed, like, clarify what you're asking me. Like, what is it that you want to know that I think about Jim Crow?
If it's if the collapse of Reconstruction is a kind of militarized effort, how do we make sense of Jim Crow as, is Jim Crow a kind of sense of like permanent low intensity warfare or something? I mean, is it, where does the role of violence and militarization fit in that?
Yeah, so they get, with Jim Crow, they can't get back to slavery, right? But they can get close, right? And Jim Crow gives them the means to do that. And what we see is that Jim Crow is violently enforced. So you've got this sort of like the violence is the engine, right, in the machine of Jim Crow. And so it plays a significant role in discouraging resistance in some respects, but they can't, hierarchy is hard. And Black people are not giving up their rights to be free, equal, and excluded. So even if they're disfranchised, they're still fighting for justice in ways that make sense to them. And so you see with the people who support Jim Crow, their need to continue using violence. It's much like the violence of chattel slavery. You can't hold people against their will in a nonviolent way. You just can't. There's no such thing as a nonviolent enslaver. You're holding someone against their will. And so you can't install and keep the system of oppression in place without different types of violence. So the violence is economic, it's cultural, it's political, it's physical, it's social. But they are able to resurrect, they're able to get back as close to the antebellum system with this system of Jim Crow as they can, I think. And here, thank you.
Thank you. Love your presentation.
Thank you.
We work, and I know a lot of people in this room work with organizations who are focused on enhancing civic engagement. And I'm thinking about all the young people that we encounter that say, what difference does it make? What I have to say doesn't matter.
Right.
What message do you have out of your scholarship that we can take to inspire the young people we encounter who have that view?
That's a great question. My students have that view too. But I call them in and out on that, right? So I call them out and say that's convenient, right? That you don't have to do anything. But I call them in terms of using these people who live during this moment and try to build a just world as an example, as something for them to consider modeling. African Americans didn't think that voting was the beginning or the end of their responsibility to their community. And I think that's one of the other things that sometimes we lose sight of, is our collective responsibility to each other, right? I vote and encourage people to vote for policies that not only affect me, but affect everyone in the community, because I have a sense of community, and that has been, for Black Americans, historically it was part of the Codex of Survival, that commitment to community. But I can understand why young people don't believe that their voices matter, because oftentimes we don't listen to them, right? We don't respect them as the intellectuals they are, as philosophers as they are. They see the world, right? And they have ideas and solutions about what might be done. They may lack access to power structures, right? That can help them make the world that they want. But part of it is that we get in their way, right? With thinking we know better than they do. With not helping them figure out, okay, well, what does it take to do this? right? This is the world you want. This is the system you want in your schools. This is, who you want to grow up to be. Well, let's get cracking to see what we can do to make it happen. We're not doing enough of that. And so why would they think that what they think or what they say matters if we're not listening to them? We're in conversation with them. We're talking about them. We're talking to them and about them, but we're not talking with them. And so I feel that helping them understand, listening to them and helping them understand and tap into systems of power is a way to do that. There's one organization that I know of, they're in New York, and one of the things that they did is they took a group of middle schoolers and they asked them, what are the things that affect you and your community that you want to do something about? And then they had meetings with like local aldermen and city council people. And they couldn't get everything that they wanted, but the elected officials actually listened and said, well, there's actually a way we can do something about that, right? And those are things that can be done in local communities today. But it means listening to the young people. And these were middle schoolers. I think you can go down even further. What kind of world? What are they seeing in the world? And sometimes we as adults, we're afraid about what they see because they see the truth, right? And so we have to deal with that if we actually want to incentivize them to do their part in making the world more just or building the world they say they want. Thank you.
This is normally the moment when I would remind everyone that we have copies of the book for sale. We've got the table set up for it, but the books didn't arrive. But I see Kim Cooper in the back here, our store manager, and it looks like she has a sign-up sheet. So what should folks do? Okay, so the books, yeah, and we should be able to get signed copies for anybody who wants. But yeah, so Kim will be at the book selling table. Come talk to Kim. She can get it straight.
And if the books are here sometime today, I'll come back and sign them. If they're here before my Uber comes tomorrow at 9, I'll come back and sign them. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Don't forget about the Rosenwald screening at 2 o'clock on Sunday in this space. Come back next week for Ben Fothery's History is Lunch. One more time, thank you, Kidada Williams, for this fantastic program today.
Thank you.